Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along today. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself and also some of the members of our research group who unfortunately can't be here today, but nevertheless, who have very much influenced what we will be discussing today. So I'm Saraya. I've been working with feedback since October 2020, originally as an intern with a company called, an NGO rather, called Brighton Food Factory. And then I returned in June 2021 to work with them again as a participatory action researcher. And there will be more about what that all means later. I'm currently undertaking a PhD in Shakespeare studies, and my background, as you might guess from that, is primarily in literature and theatre. As I will discuss later, I'm very keen to use PAR as a process to bridge the gap between literature and kind of the scientific language that we associate more so with discussions of the climate and also the food system. So a bit about our group. So originally it wasn't just myself, Warami and James. There was also Carolina, who is with us today all the way from Colombia, and we're very happy she could make it. And there was also 7 other 18 to 25-year-olds. So the point of the PAR group was that we were all between that age group of 18 and 25. So what we were doing was really very much so a young person's perspective. We are a very intersectional group. We all come from quite different backgrounds, but at the same time, we definitely all had commonalities between us. I'm going to give some examples of the kinds of interests other members of our group had when it came to the food system, because we all kind of explored our own things at different points. So one member, Shabir, discussed how school meals have reflected societal Islamophobia through their failure to supply halal alternatives for Muslim students. Another member, Natalie, is neurodivergent, meaning that she is on the autistic spectrum. And we will talk a bit more about that later as well. She created a manifesto which discussed how employers in the food system should be more inclusive towards neurodivergent employees, because unfortunately, a lot of the way that employers work is very much geared towards a neurotypical person. And she wrote a brilliant piece kind of combating that and advocating for change. So yeah, now I will hand over to Warami.
Thank you, Saraya. Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. Regardless of our excited expectations of having this year's conference in person, COVID has yet again done its thing. And although it is through a screen, I'm honored to have a voice contributing to the UK's farming scene at the front lines, at one of the front lines. I'm Warami Jackson, and like Saraya, I have history with working with Feedback Global before my re-employment for this PAR project. I'm currently a final year undergrad at the Royal Agricultural University in Cirencester, taking an agriculture and applied farm management degree. And it has been an absolute pleasure working with my aforementioned colleagues, as a lot of creative, positive solutions developed from the project, of which we'll later highlight. And we were eventually opportune to share these findings and solutions at the COP26 2021 climate change event a few months ago in Glasgow, at an event hosted by Norwich, Scotland. And this was successfully done in an attempt to include the food and agriculture system within long-standing climate issues. So here we're hoping you have a cup of tea, some water or coffee, and enjoy the presentation for the next hour.
Next slide, please, Anna. So we're just going to tell you a bit about what we called our mother question. So when we were doing our PAR process, the question was, taking into consideration our individual and collective lived experience, how might we transition towards a just and regenerative food system? So that was in a nutshell, what our overall goal was. It was to figure out what this might look like, and also how we might not just theorize it, but actually go out and enact this change. So next slide, please. So the next thing to discuss is what is PAR, because I'm assuming that quite a lot of you probably haven't heard of PAR, which is very understandable. I'd never heard of PAR before I heard about it from feedback. I don't think it's something that is particularly mainstream at this time, and I think Warami would agree with me, I think it's something that should be a lot more mainstream. So PAR is officially defined as a research methodology that aims to decolonize knowledge. It holds the everyday knowledge of action researchers at the center of the process and views it as equal to expert knowledge. So that's the key thing that's different about PAR. PAR doesn't take specific kind of experts in a field that already know about it. The aim of it is to educate people that maybe don't actually know as much about, for example, the food system, and to have them be active participants. So normally in research, of course, we'd have a division between the researcher and the participant. But for us, we too ourselves were also participants learning along the way. That's not to say we didn't have other participants as well, though, because we did. So we've got kind of three key pillars of what PAR is. So I'm just going to read out the first one for you. So it's anti-elitist. Research is not only about publications, and that's something I'm really quite passionate about within academia. We have this idea of what counts as kind of research that is knowledge that should be known, and what is seen as kind of not worthy. And actually, in reality, research can be so much more than merely kind of academic publications that we see. Research is not something abstract to be undertaken purely for academic purposes. It is the launch pad for inspired collective action that changes our day-to-day reality. So that quote's from Recreate International, who have some amazing quotes on what PAR is, if anyone wants to look them up. So I'll pass back to Warami now to tell you about the other two pillars.
Thank you, Saraya. At this point, I'm sure a number of you are kind of wondering how this links to the food system and how this is a lot about research and things. But the process requires a lot of open-mindedness, because at the end of the day, it's really beneficial to whatever subject area you're talking about, and really helps you get into it without just surface level education and just based on what's been put out there. In terms of collaborative, PAR tends to sit on the pillar of collaboration. The way it works is using the muse as inspiration and researcher. So it's a very communicative, open door method that allows a lot of reflection and contribution from all parties. It's applied research, hence the researchers themselves have to apply themselves to the situation or the subject. And it's a very unconventional model. So kind of see it as the lab rats are very much involved in the experiments as much as the professor. And it's a very magnetic process, pulling in organizations, groups, networks to a really great advantage. I would like to say the only limit to this process is the lack of like-mindedness. But thankfully, it needs mainly like-minded groups. So it tends to be very collaborative when it finds people who are very much like-minded and share the same values within the goal for the greater positive results. And when we talk about recreating, there is a lot of deepening connection and growth with everyone involved in PAR. It is near impossible to come out the same without a change in mindset when you go through a process like this. We tend to internalize the structures and the norms of the systems that we are inhabiting. And in this case, a food system that is justified, and we're able to utilize and adopt the values that are available. So we get to experience a space we created where everything that we are, our stories, can emerge and engage or be part of the story. to question our personal beliefs, to gain inspiration, and let go of withholding structures that are not useful. And you can see that when we briefly express our previous knowledge of the food system before encountering PAR.
Fab. Okay, next slide, please, Anna. So we're now going to tell you a little bit about what we knew about the food system before PAR. So I would definitely say I knew less than Warami because I am very much not an agricultural student. Before PAR, I knew very little about the food system, and also before my internship. My internship was kind of the beginning of me learning a lot, and then PAR kind of solidified and helped that flourish further. So growing up, I had no idea at all that the food system was broken. I gave up meat when I was 18, but my reasoning had nothing to do with the climate. I had absolutely no clue that meat accounts for 60% of greenhouse gases from food production. Like many people, I never really thought about where my food came from. I never really, I hate to say this at a farming conference, but I never really thought about the farmers. I associated it with the supermarket alone, like I'm sure many people do, rather than the process that it had gone through in order to get there. I'd been taught to believe that organic shopping was something people did to be fancy and show off, rather than something that people do to be sustainable. I didn't see what the issue was if my oranges had been flown in from Costa Rica rather than grown in my own country or even county. If you had told me about seasonal produce, I would have been absolutely clueless about what you meant. So it's safe to say I didn't know much at all. Like many people, I've been taught not to question the food system, but to have blind faith in it, not to see the behind the scenes, but to completely just blindly trust that it was working as it should do. I was half right. The food system is working as it should do. It's working as it's designed to. The problem is it's designed to be unsustainable. That is the issue. So that's kind of where I was before I started this journey. Yeah, so over to you, Warami, on what you knew about the food system before.
Thank you. Due to my agricultural student background and previous work in the industry, I was opportune to know to a certain degree how fragmented the UK food system is. I had awareness on this from a systemic perspective, whereby there was a lot of injustice in availability, accessibility, the true price of food, labor, power, knowledge within the food system. I realized knowledge of the food and agriculture system was a bit blindsided in favor of conventional growing practices, high-end food shopping outlets, which don't reflect the true prices of food, the lack of inclusivity and diversity in job opportunities, therefore creating a certain stereotype of the conventional farmer being the older white male, as well as lack of knowledge on the food and agricultural contribution to climate change. And this was long after being conditioned to think that as a future farmer, application of the right amounts of fertilizer was enough for soil conservation and sustainability. And as a shopper, I was not then I believe I was not naive and contributing to the problem by my religious high-end outlet shopping practices. And although with this said knowledge, I still didn't grasp how well and how exactly this directly affected the masses and the results of these issues on the mindset of the individuals and population. So that right there was my unknown challenge. And at the realization of our challenges collectively, myself and our colleagues were confronted with a choice. That's a call to leadership, a purpose, by seeking opportunities for change, and opportunity that we found through PAR, organized by feedback. The survey findings of a survey we did for our research, post the research phase, led to the action phase, where through this PAR process, we used our individual creative processes to produce video, graphic illustrations, and poetry to express our findings and explore to decentralize knowledge and provide plausible, accessible solutions for everyone, and one of which Saraya will highlight now.
Cool. So I'm going to talk a bit about creative approaches to the food system. So I said I'd return to the subject of neurodiversity, and I'm going to kind of touch on that now. So of our PAR group, 5 of us were neurotypical. If you're not sure what neurotypical means, it means, I'm not going to give you the exact definition, but it means to not be neurodiverse, and neurodiverse is to be on the autistic spectrum. So of our PAR group, we were made up of a combination of both neurotypical and neurodiverse participants. And one of the things that was so brilliantly highlighted by both of those members, in particular Natalie, was the way that through her experience in working in the food system, things were not designed in order to work with her and to support her. Things were designed in order to support neurotypical people. And this was a real issue. So something to kind of bounce off of that I'd like you all to kind of have a think about is, how can we make education on the food system more accessible for all people? Because I feel that at the moment, it's quite a closed circle in many ways. And I'm going to kind of come at that now from my own experiences and how I felt a little bit perhaps alienated from the narrative growing up. So what's really key is that we all learn in different ways. As part of my BA in English at Sussex University, I took a module in my final year called Literature and the Environment. One thing I loved about Sussex was the way they championed interdisciplinary learning, striving to explore key topics in innovative ways. Next slide, please. Thank you. Growing up, I often felt that I couldn't speak on or access knowledge surrounding the climate crisis because the way it was taught to me was so scientific. I am naturally a more creative person, and my brain can struggle to comprehend things when they're explained to me in kind of scientific jargon. While facts and figures are definitely important, often the way that they're communicated to us, such as, again, maybe in academic papers, for example, it can have quite a dehumanizing effect. We need to humanize the climate crisis, and through that, the way that we talk about the food system and how to fix it. Through PAR, which champions unconventional and creative ways of sharing research, I learned that when it comes to educating people on the climate crisis, we need to be discussing the issue on an interdisciplinary level, inviting those with less scientific brains, like myself, for example, to feel they can be a part of the discussion too. The literature and the environment module I did marked the first time in my life that I felt I could understand the climate crisis. What is more, it was the first time I felt passionate about combating it. It was the first time I felt a desire to act and perhaps change the way I was living. I remember reading Naomi Booth's 2014 novel that I'd highly recommend. It's called Sealed. It's a very dystopian, macabre, anthropocentric tale of a world in which we have contaminated the earth to the point that our bodies reject it. In the novel, skin starts sealing over people's mouths, eyes, and other orifices. These people are gradually and slowly suffocated by their own bodies. Let me tell you, this book made me feel something, like really feel something. Like I literally cried in my university library. It was really embarrassing. I binged the novel in a day, utterly immersed in the story. That book and the discussions about it in our seminar that we then had that week made me feel more passionate and educated on the climate crisis than science class ever had. This is why I believe mediums like storytelling and poetry should be incorporated more into discussions on the climate crisis and through that, the food system. So as an example of this, I'm going to share a poem I wrote around the time we were going to COP. It was very inspired by events happening that week of COP. And the poem is about my own journey with the food system, from complete obliviousness to now kind of awareness and a desire to really change the way I live and kind of spread the word about how other people can do that too, in a non-preachy way, of course. Okay, so this poem is called Growing. So it goes, growing up, when it came to food, options were overflowing. Strawberries, steak, lamb kebabs, avocados. Not once did I think about where they were growing, unknowingly contributing to the planet's deterioration, pouring gasoline on the fire for Earth's cremation. Growing up, when it came to food, I didn't realize the other side of the world was on my doorstep. Swore I couldn't go a day without meat, a carnivore, repeatedly pouring lashings of gravy on my prey, filling fridges like we were prepping for doomsday. A web of lies that I didn't even know I was spinning the silk for. Growing up, when it came to food, every Christmas my church had the children fill shoeboxes with food for the poor. We didn't think it through that one day a year doesn't fix world hunger. Both young and old, too deluded, endorsing our savior complexes to conclude that a plaster wraps up a wound but not its source. Almost grown up, when it came to food, I started to ask questions. One day, as meat entered my intestines, I found myself feeling thrown. A mask glued onto me was peeling off as I realized I was eating a goat. Prick stick wasn't strong enough to stop me seeing that this meat digesting in me once bleated had a heart that beated. So why had I been taught to separate meat and animal as though they were two? Grown up, when it comes to food, I see things as they really are. Prick stick isn't strong enough to sew up a system so scarred that it was made to fail, too decayed to locate the root of the problem, too betrayed by billionaires, too afraid to derail their egos to be eco-friendly, driving in their Bentleys while Earth struggles to exhale. We've been failed. Grown up, when it comes to the food system, options are running out. There's no doubt that now is the time for us to come together to call out politicians who can't even pretend to care enough to open their eyes. Now is the time to say enough is enough, to read through their lies, because words without action are as empty as forests without trees. And performatively tossing some coins in a fountain speaks more volumes than the food transferred into landfills. Now is the time not to cower, but to fight an uphill battle that we cannot lose. Now is the time to take back the power before our planet becomes a bomb site. In the words of Greta, now is not the time for any more blah, blah, blah. Now is the time to do what's right before the door closes and we are immersed in eternal night. Okay, thank you. So in the poem, I followed a form of narrative that's called public narrative. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that now. So next slide, please. Great. So public narrative is a type of narrative which weaves three stories into one story. So this type of narrative is very commonly used by campaigners to achieve a certain goal. Once you're aware of this strategy, you will start seeing it popping up everywhere. So a really common example is we see it a lot in adverts for campaigns in particular. And as I said, the poem I just read you, I wrote it following this format. Public narratives begins with the story of the self. This is a personal story. Gann says it shows why you were called to what you have been called to. The story of self invites the listener to connect with the teller, to empathize with them, to feel something. Next is the story of us. This is a collective story which, according to Gans, illustrates the shared purposes, goals, and visions of a community or organization. The story of us invites people to feel part of your community. Finally, we have the story of now. This is about the challenge a community now faces. It's something immediate. As Gans puts it, it's urgent. It invites people to join you in taking hopeful action to combat the pressing challenge. For example, making sure we can fix the food system to make it better for the planet. This is an effective method for helping people to learn about and find the desire to help to transform the food system. So just to have, if you will have a look at the apples. So the first apple we've got here is the story of self. So in terms of the food system, this may be a call to leadership. So it's, you know, the challenge that's being faced, your own individual story with the food system, the choices you make in terms of, for example, where you're purchasing your food from and the kinds of food that you're purchasing. Any values, sorry, post has just come through my door. Great timing. Any values you may have, any of those key things. The next thing is the story of us. So with the food system, this may be sharing the values and coming together as a collective and discussing our values surrounding food, the growing of food, the farming of food, and kind of coming together as a collective to connect over those shared values. And the final one, of course, is the story of now. So this is about how are we going to respond to the challenge? How are we going to transform the food system as a collective, taking into account our individual lived experiences, because they are all different and each of us have something different to bring. So that's kind of what's really key with this. And I'd say the other thing that's really important with all of this that I'm kind of saying is that I mentioned earlier, it's about making you feel something. People are not going to act if they don't feel something. People need to feel passion. They need to be given the opportunity to feel empowered, but also that they can have the passion and the drive to actually not just be all talk, but to actually go out and change the way that, for example, they're shopping. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, fabulous. So it's also important to think about which stories are being left out. At COP, we heard from numerous people from Indigenous communities. These people know how to work with nature rather than dominating nature as colonization, and also, I would argue, capitalism has. Yet these people and their knowledge were not being given a seat at the table at COP at all, or in society. It is our job as well to know when to take a step back and amplify voices like these so that their truth can be a part of the narrative too. Because so often we are sadly seeing a lot of the same voices having the power. So how can we also make our discussions of the food system as intersectional as possible and make sure that we really diversify the voices involved? That comes back to neurodiversity, and neurodiverse voices also being an example of voices that are being really heavily left out of this discussion on the food system. Josh, who was another one of our members who is on the autistic spectrum, he's a brilliant artist and illustrator, and he used his illustrations through his approach in order to come to a really great manifesto and solution to a way that we can transform the food system. And later on, when we talk about solutions, Warami will talk you through his manifesto. So to conclude this part of the talk, I would like to leave you with this. As part of our research, we carried out a survey to see how the everyday person views the food system and whether they are aware of any of the issues within it. Spoiler alert, many of them were not, which unfortunately was kind of what we were expecting to find. In the spirit of PAR, we wanted to produce the results in a way that values creativity and accessibility, and which bridges the gap between science and literature when it comes to climate change and the food system. After all, If we had printed these findings in a paper, how many people would have actually read our survey results? Probably not many. For this reason, we put our survey responses into a poem. I had a great time loving my life on iMovie. Here is the result. So yeah, the next slide should be the video, Anna.
The UK food system is
not the best.
Difficult to acquire quality baked goods, even bread.
There's a huge variety of food groups available.
Easy to access, but not the most sustainable.
The UK food system is
fast food.
Meat and dairy is too mass-produced.
Needs to be reduced.
Artificial elements have been introduced.
The UK food system is
Tesco's,
Morrison's,
Aldi,
and Waitrose.
Unnecessary waste.
Throwing out food.
Grown the other side of the world.
Factory produced.
Some say the UK food system is
well structured and fairly efficient.
Looks okay.
Fair.
Versatile.
Decent.
There's something for everyone.
Roast dinner.
Mashed potato.
vast.
Abundant.
Everything is fast.
To the question, does the UK food system need to change?
Amongst the range of responses lurked the following selection.
Not really, no.
Not necessarily.
N.A.
Not too fussed about it.
The UK food system is
high quality,
good value,
wide variation.
Views on the UK food system have been spoken.
The truth is that the UK food system is broken.
The global food system is responsible for 30% of greenhouse gases.
It's time for the people of the UK to gather in masses to say that it's not okay.
That every year 8 million tons of plastic waste escapes into the oceans.
And that's just from coastal nations.
We can't be patient.
We need to make waves and put them into motion.
Campaign against food poverty.
Shop local.
Seasonal.
Sustainable.
Eat less meat. Be vocal. Let's stop our planet from ending up in the morgue.
For more info on what you can do, visit feedbackglobal.org.
Okay, cool. Thanks for watching that. It lagged a little bit for me, so sorry if that happened to other people. Zoom. But I hope you still got a kind of sense of what was all going on there. And yeah, as I said, I really think that something like this it's a way to not just bridge the gap between literature and more kind of scientific language surrounding the climate crisis, and the food system, but it is also just a great way for people to just feel something and emote and relate and feel that passion kind of bubbling within them to act. So yeah, I will now pass on to Warami, who's going to talk you through some of our key findings from that survey that that video was taken from.
Thank you, Saraya. Next slide, please, Anna. Thank you. From the mother question that we showed you at the beginning, a general theme emerged, which was education, knowledge, and information, where myself, Saraya, and another co-worker, Marlon, did this survey and analyzed it, got our results, which we have, put into stats to display for the findings to be displayed. The said theme birthed our umbrella question, which was, what is your reality of the food system? So the questions, about 10, 11 questions that we had in our survey was kind of inspired by the question, what is your reality of the food system? And we conducted qualitative research through surveys and interviews on our target audience, and some general findings are as follows on the slides. So we found that 19% of the participants think about the farmers' efforts towards the food grown when they go shopping. So you can tell that that's not generally a large number, and it's possibly resulted from the disconnection between farmers and consumers due to longer supply chains and high-end outlets where majority of the population do their shopping. And we found 23.4% shop locally or short food supply chains fully, or either they combine that with high-end supermarket outlets. And 32% do not think of the climate at all when food shopping, with a trend of reasons being amongst the following on the next slide. Here are a couple reasons why people, the 32% of them do not think of the climate at all when food shopping. So you can see it has no opinion, more concern to remember everything needed. If I want it, I get it. Don't really consider the climate, as most foods unfortunately exploit the environment. That's the only way we get our shopping done. And yeah, so basically the reasons why they don't think about all this is they prioritize other things, and it kind of emphasizes how people really think climate consciousness equates to plastic consciousness. So food and the agricultural system is not necessarily always in the agenda when we think of the climate, which is a bit sad, as it is one of the main contributors and one of the main solutions to the climate crisis. From the survey, we kind of picked all these out and many more, but it emphasized the point that we're trying to make, that we need more people to think intentionally about how they shop, where they shop, and how they, go about their food and their relationship with food within the system and the urgent climate crisis that we currently have. Next slide, please. Now, we had a snapshot of the non-climate reasons people feel the food system should change. So things that don't have to do with climate. We had greater support of British farming and the reunion of the EU to restore old trade deals. We had people saying that food banks should be stocked with food that would have been thrown away to reduce waste. We had people thinking pricing must change to allow people from working class backgrounds access to healthier food. So it's like a fairer system. We had to be more concerned about the health and general well-being of its people. There needs to be less chemically enhanced food on the shelves, particularly fruits. I guess they've probably noticed because of how quickly these things spoil when you have them in the fridge. Even in the countryside, it was difficult to find small local shops that sell unprocessed food. So that's generally describing how scarce and unavailable a lot of these local outlets are. Then it needs to be more inclusive. A lot of people are moving towards better lifestyle changes in terms of food. So it needs more people involved. There needs to be cheaper, healthier options, as junk food is cheaper to buy, so it's more convenient. And processed food, takeaway foods are high in salt and calories, and salt is really bad. So we have people thinking about health-wise and their gut health, and food should be valued more and the likes. So this seemed like a social justice chat, as James was saying yesterday. So we have people that are generally interested and concerned about these issues that we're raising, which is why it's really important that the talk continues and that we keep going on about it. Now, Saraya is going to explain to us with an analogy called queer ecology as one of the solutions to the climate change.
Cool. Thank you so much, Warami. Yeah, Warami, that was such a great job of like talking through all of kind of what we found. And to be honest, I don't know why I just said all. That was actually only a snapshot of it. We unfortunately don't have time to give you all the responses, but we wish we did, because there was lots of other kind of very interesting things that we found. So I'm going to talk about using queer ecology as a solution. So, as many of you may have noticed, I am very passionate about bringing in interdisciplinary approaches to discussions of the food system and climate change. So that's why I want to talk a little bit to you about queer ecology and what it is, because it's something that I actually am not sure a lot of people really know about. So I want to begin first with what the word queer itself means, because it's the kind of word that is very loaded, and I think a lot of people can have perhaps misinterpretations about it. So my PhD is on Shakespeare and queer theory. So of course I was going to find a way to slip queer theory into this talk today. But don't worry, I won't be talking about Shakespeare, although there are very interesting works on ecology in Shakespeare, if anyone is interested. So in the dictionary, queer is defined as something strange, odd, and peculiar. When people hear the word queer, they associate it with someone's sexuality or gender. It is true that queerness and queer theory is about sexuality and gender, but it is also about so much more. Queer theory is perhaps best described by Lee Edelman, who writes that queerness can never define an identity, it can only ever disturb one. Queer theory is the study of anything anti-normative, that is, anything which disrupts normative systems. Noreen Giffney and Mira J. Hurd describe queerness as having an unremitting resistance to categorization. One of the first things I remember learning at Sussex Uni in one of my first seminars was our lecturer said to us, humans love to categorize things. And that has really stuck with me ever since. As humans, we love to navigate the unknown around us, and we do it by putting people and things into categories. It simplifies the world. It makes it less frightening to us if we do so. The problem is, it's not a reflection of reality, and it is certainly not a reflection of the earth and the environment. So the result is that we are, by categorizing, we are inhibiting ourselves from seeing the complex realities of all living things on our planet. Next slide, please. So now we've discussed what queer theory is. So it's, just to recap, anything anti-normative, anything that challenges a system's norms. We will now talk about what queer ecology is and then link it all back to the food system. So queer ecology looks at how, as humans, we have warped nature by imposing our own heteronormative categories onto it. Because heterosexuality, in more recent history, because of figures like Darwin, has been seen as the normative. Anything that is not heterosexual is now anti-normative and therefore has kind of been seen as unnatural. But that doesn't mean it's actually unnatural. We've just imposed that onto nature. So over history, we have erased the parts of nature which don't fit into these heteronormative categories. In other words, we have erased the queer bits. As Catriona Mortimer Sanderland explains in a brilliant book on queer ecology, there is a normative pairing of nature with heterosexuality. Following Darwin's theory of evolution, this became the default view. I will also say Western colonialism is also very much to blame for this. As a result, it was conveniently neglected that, for example, there are fish that change gender and a species of worm with 3 sexes. We have made nature unnatural. In ecologist Joanne Roughgarden's also brilliant text, Evolution's Rainbow, she writes about how all Hawaiian geckos are female and reproduce asexually, and how the most common body form among plants is for an individual to be both male and female, either at the same or at different parts of its life. There are so many more examples that Joan lists of queer plants and animals. However, if I were to list them all, it would take far more time than we have. At the end of the day, we have imposed heteronormativity and the Western gender binary that comes with it onto nature, because it is what we view as natural. As Alex Johnson notes, no man can categorize those relations, so nature, without lying. Ultimately, as the Institute of Queer Ecology explain, queer ecology works to undo dangerously destructive human-centric hierarchies. So it all comes back to the Anthropocene, the idea that we as humans see ourselves as kind of the center of everything. Next slide, please. So this now begs the question, how has anything I've just said related at all to the food system? I will explain. So how can we apply queer ecology to transforming the food system, to the solutions that we can now find in helping it to be more regenerative? So for the sake of time, I'm going to give just one example of a way that we can apply queer ecology to solutions on the food system. That example is wonky fruit and veg, also known as ugly fruit and veg. 1/3 of food produced globally goes to waste. That's an astronomical 1.3 billion tons of food a year. Ugly or wonky produce makes up to 40% of annual food waste. This perfectly good produce is left to rot in landfills, releasing methane. Why? Because it's queer. As I mentioned earlier, queer refers to anything that is deemed anti-normative. Supermarkets, this is very largely the fault of supermarkets in recent years. They've imposed very strict normative, as I'm sure you're all aware, standards of what is deemed cosmetically acceptable produce and what is deemed cosmetically unacceptable produce. This means that many supermarkets refuse to accept any produce a farmer has grown, which is classified as ugly. Philip Benn, CEO of Imperfect Foods, explains that a small quirk in appearance based on shape, size, or color that has no impact on flavor or nutrition can lead to perfectly good produce being wasted. I'd really take note of his use of the word quirk. I can very much see quirk as a kind of synonym for queer in many ways. For years, myself and many others were conditioned to believe that the fruit and veg we saw in supermarkets was what all fruit and veg looked like. A little bit like the assumption that everyone is born heterosexual, for example. I had absolutely no idea that carrots could have multiple bodies, or that tomatoes weren't always the perfect glossy red I saw in the vegetable aisle. It had been conveniently left out that potatoes, the most wasted food item in the UK, could come in many different shapes and sizes. The queer reality of produce has been largely pushed into the shadows. In reality, fruit and veg categorized as misshapen and therefore queer and imperfect, anti-normative, is just as delicious as the produce that we're seeing in supermarkets. Interestingly, in our survey, out of 77 people, only 7 said they associate food waste with the food system. That's literally 10%. No, that's not, my maths is terrible. Ignore that, it's not 10%. If we began to see the ecology and the food system through queer eyes, our standards of what is deemed edible may change, resulting in more knowledge of the problem of food waste, and consequently, we would hopefully have far less food waste. One way to support this shift is to support your local farmers purchasing their locally grown wonky produce. And I'm sure we've probably all noticed there has been an uptake in kind of selling and marketing wonky produce and like odd boxes and stuff. But I still feel that there is a long way to go if we're going to be reducing that 40% figure of wonky veg making up that amount of annual food waste. The final thing just to say on this is just to link it all back to PAR as well, is that the PAR process too inspired these thoughts in me, because the PAR process is inherently queer. Queer theory is anti-elitist, it's about recreating, it's about being anti-normative, it's very anti-academia in a lot of ways, and the PAR process too centers on all of these things. So the PAR process, it was through that I very much kind of got to this point of thinking, which I'm very grateful for. So yeah, right, I'm going to pass back to Warami now, who is going to talk to us about some more solutions and the actions that we can now take in order to transform our food system. So over to you, Warami.
Honestly, I have to commend Saraya for the brilliant analogy relating the queer ecology to understanding the food system. Prior to working with her, I had never thought of the linkage, so it's absolutely brilliant. Now, let's take a breather as we recognize that that was a lot of information to intake and process. It's been so much useful information that we've gotten, and it's just a second to really take it all in before we move on to the next bit. And in this moment, I also implore you to use this chance to write down any comments or questions you may have in the chat box, which we would definitely attend to at the end of the session. I'm going to express how emotional engagement through storytelling provides a solution as described by Marshall Gans, who we've been mentioning about the story of Us Now, but tailored to the understanding of the food system and the climate. So it's important first that we know that naturally as humans, we react out of habit, which is why emotional engagement is very important, because it creates mindful actions using what we value to move us to engage challenges proactively instead of distancing ourselves from them. Emotional information, as some people think, is not childish information, but critical information to understand ourselves and the world and how to operate in it. The challenge of the food system and the climate change requires intentional, mindful actions, and storytelling is a creative and powerful tool in bringing out that mindful action that we speak of. So stories draw on our emotions and show our values in action by helping us feel what matters rather than just thinking about it or telling others what matters. Because stories allow us to express our values, but not just as abstract principles, but as lived experiences, they have the power to move others. You can only feel and do so much about what you value as much. When knowledge of the climatic situation and the food system is shared through experiences, we tend to first identify with the protagonist in the story, and then experience and internalize some of the emotions evoked. Then we gain the resources needed to be choiceful, agentic human beings in our efforts. But we may think, how is this possible? When this happens, something happens and it's called constructive anxiety, one of the emotions that are evoked. So some of the emotions evoked from stories of the climate and the food system, such as fear, worry, anxiety, hopelessness, either as a shopper or a farmer, when you think about, the state the world is in due to the food system or due to the climate caused by the food system, sometimes it can cause a disassociation. And it's worse even when people find out that they've been naively part of the problem or the reality of the consequences of this problem. But this provoked anxiety can be positive, and that's what we term constructive anxiety. So sometimes this is necessary in leadership to create enough talent to shake people out of the natural, habitual way of screening everything out that differs from their habits and lifestyle, and gets them into a fresh way of thinking. And this can mainly be done through emotional anxiety. Now, how can this constructive anxiety be created? Next slide, please. One of the ways that the constructive anxiety can be created is the urgency of need or opportunity. So by creating the urgency of need or opportunity, the awareness of the climate change is one of the things that can help create the urgency of need as to why the subject of the broken food system is really important, prompting action. and the urgency of opportunity at the given time, the values instilled in them would manifest. So creating urgency is one powerful tool for breaking through. So the awareness of the food and agricultural contribution to climate change and other issues, expressing how our actions can't wait any longer and we're on a timer, gets people to that urgency of need and urgency of opportunity. And when the opportunity arises, the values they have then would be useful to present itself in action. Take, for example, in the first frame of the next slide, the act of storytelling is proposed in order to engage constructive anxiety through the urgency of need, whereby the individual seen here is going through the phases of identifying with the protagonist as they are explaining their personal stories of the food system, prompting him to consider what, why, how to take small steps. So he internalizes some of these emotions that are evoked from the people telling the story, causing him to adopt the urgency of need, foregoing his habitual thinking for a fresh way of thinking, also known as the consciousness that we've been mentioning. So when the opportunity then arises for action in the second frame, next slide, represented by a need to shop, as he has run out of groceries since the last time he shopped. He's definitely now equipped with already the consciousness to make a choice, a productive, positive choice, as seen in the third frame. So you can see here, he's gained the consciousness and is hovering around him, thinking of the next action to do because of the storytelling phase when the urgency of need was created and the opportunity presented itself. So here he finds himself in the local farmer's market because he was attentive. He has those values now where he thought about he needs to make an action that is positively contributing to a just food system, where he finds fresh salad, wonky and queer but natural vegetables that are, sustainably grown, and where he meets different different classes of people in the food and farming sector in terms of diversity and where they're from. There's just so much accessibility in these kind of scenarios. So then he has these abilities to invest himself in things relating to this, thereby making a move towards a step in the right direction. In the next slide, the next way that you can do this is through anger. And I know when we hear anger, we may think of, oh, that might be such a negative way to create something positive at the end. But we define it as the outrage, a reaction, the dissonance between the world as it is and as it ought to be. So your anger could be farmers ought to have their pay. You should know where your food comes from. There should be diversity in the food. There should be less non-sustainable packaging and accessibility to healthier, more nutritious food options. Your food should have traveled less miles. The soils should be more taken care of. So these are the things that could stem up the anger in you. And it's a very crucial dissonance because it creates the tension that can result in action. Or even if the opportunity to act isn't there straight away, it can lead us to be ready to act when the opportunity then arises. And the third way is hope and self-belief. As corny as it all sounds, it is very, very, very important for the agenda that we have now. And this is defined by believing in the plausibility of the possible over the necessity of the probable. I'm going to say it again. It's basically experiencing the possible against the probable. Most people choose to term themselves a realist, but to be realistic is to recognize the probable, which is most likely to happen, doesn't always happen, and sometimes the possible does. In self-belief and self-efficacy is the experience that your singular contribution can make a difference. Now, a lot of consumers have the mindset that their contribution towards the food system and climate change would go unnoticed in the grand scheme of things because they're just one out of a billion. And then they choose not to act. But it's the same as voting. If we put a voting situation down and you were going to vote for one candidate and suddenly we hear that, oh, he lost by one vote. Definitely it might be bizarre or wild to think that it might be your one vote that could have changed the situation. But what if it could have been your one vote that tipped it over to get them to where they need to be? So this is realizing that compared to the probable, your efforts is one of the little steps down the road of systemic change. The possible, like the results of my aforementioned PAR co-workers, Risha Josh, who in the next slide, created a manifesto offered as one of the possible solutions. And now he termed this the one pot community for social change activism, whereby abandoned infrastructure can be utilized as food community co-ops in towns where seasonally grown and available foods grown by the people in the community is also cooked by the people for the people. So everything comes from within, and there's shared responsibilities. Now, this is just one of the many, many solutions that came out of this and potentials that can be in terms of the food system in communities. So I use the acronym YCMAD, you can make a difference. So now you have personally supported a local farmer and also contributed to the sustainable efforts towards climate change and a worthy food system. From the research, due to accessibility and affordability issues, it's not necessarily realistic for a lot of individuals to hop into a complete change in shopping habits and diets. But they need to also remember that one step in the right direction is still a step closer to hopefully new, healthy, more sustainable habits formation. Now, the last slide in the next thank you. The last slide shows following weeks after the first local shopping experience of the individual that we've been graphically illustrating, where he tries to find a balance in shopping for fresh foods and fruits while shopping for canned and other necessities in the high-end outlets. And this is just a practical example of a sustainable lifestyle with food. We understand that it is a very, very long and turbulent road to the just food system, but it doesn't isolated from being impossible. So here in week 2, he finds a balance where he's gotten his fresh fed and some things that he needs to get from one of the high-end shopping outlets from there. And other weeks where he's able to get more than enough from there. And this is just one of the suggestions and solutions that we try to preach to the masses in order to move towards the direction that we're aiming at. In the next slide, the fourth way that we can get there is through empathy. Now, we need to empathize with the situation enough to do something about it. If you don't care about something, you will never have the values you need for the action concerning the said thing. So we need to care about the environment. We need to care about the gut health, the farmers, the community. There's so many things that need our empathy in order for it to work. So definitely, we need to empathize with the situation. So now we have created this challenge to encourage the capacity for hope, empathy, self-worth, and this enables us to access the emotional resources we need to respond to food and climate challenges courageously. In the next slide, I don't know what your views of the food system might be, but this is mine, which I have attempted to illustrate here, a broken food system. Now, the bricks in front of us represent some of the many topics of concern, which also prefer solutions. So we can see the diversity, the inclusion, cultural, appropriate, local, organic, sustainable, and compensated farmers. These subjects arose from the problems that we have seen and the problems from the rest of our co-workers were experiencing, and what, from my knowledge, I view as the problems within the food system. And I'm going to definitely break down and analyze what these bricks are in the next slide. Local here in this context represents short food supply chains. And by that, we mean the likes of farmers markets, organic stores, odd boxes, box schemes, collection points, and such. Now, these are really important in this day because they offer the 3 tiers of sustainability, which are, the first one is social sustainability. And this happens by restoring the relationship and connectivity between the small scale farmer or producer and the consumer in order to enhance trustworthiness, assurance, and traceability of the food so customers and consumers can know where the food comes from. The second tier is the economic sustainability, and this is done by ensuring that when a purchase takes place, a noble amount of the dividend goes back to the farmer and producer for their efforts. So they're properly compensated, and it's usually reflected through premium pricing on the products, which is usually somewhat higher than the conventional prices that we find in the stores. Now, the environmental sustainability, the third tier, is by encouraging farmers and producers who use sustainably improving systems of growing, such as agroecological or organic or biodynamic growing practices, which attempts to combat climate change, soil degradation, and the likes. So these also involve short travel distances that we term food miles, therefore reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere compared with what food traveled far and wide distances to get to their destinations contribute to the GHG emissions. In terms of culturally appropriate, this context is the representation of culture and beliefs in food, such as accessibility to halal food, which was one of the main issues one of our co-workers was emphasizing on, food from different cultures being affordably grown here, as opposed to being transported from miles away and dried and stored for purchase in different stores. In terms of diversity, we mean the diversity in the crops of the soil for soil conservation purposes, as opposed to intensive monocropping, which we tend to see a lot and is very, very profit driven. And it's also necessary for engaging consumer preferences. By diversity, we also mean diversity within the food system, within the labor. So this is the shift from the stereotype that I mentioned at the beginning by the typical farmer you see being the older white male. We need more diversity from different cultures, different sexes and ages. And it's one of the many problems we see as a lack of representation. So we need more representation because you're more likely to shop and to engage with where you find yourself, as opposed to feeling like you've been excluded from a segment of group and a segment of people. In terms of inclusivity, this is the fight for equity, not equality now, equity, where everyone is giving a fair chance that's been constructed according to their needs in this situation. So for example, people with disabilities and neurodivergent people like we had in our team. So we can't ignore them even within the food and agriculture system. So you cannot think that it does not relate just because it's a human problem and not a food problem. Humans are the consumers of food and are sometimes the providers of food. So it definitely relates, and we have to create spaces for them and accommodate them whenever the need arises. The more people we exclude from the food and climate agenda, the less contributions towards the change. And it is issues that are affecting us all. So we all deserve a voice and an opportunity to contribute. With these issues and the solutions offered, and many, many, many more, a lot more than these bricks that have been illustrated and analyzed for us today, are the steps towards the systemic change that we need. Now, these are matters of urgency, and we cannot just depend on the policymakers to turn it around solely. We can start the change from the ground up. So the whole general point of this is we need to build the consciousness in order to get to this place. Thank you. And now we're going to go back to how the PAR has transformed us. When we're describing the PAR process, we let you know that it's impossible to remain the same. And the PAR, in the beginning, our mindset, we expressed that, and now we're going to express how it's transformed us at this stage.
Cool. Thank you so much, Warami. I had a temporary panic there where I was told my microphone had failed and I missed some of what you were saying, but what I did hear was absolutely brilliant. Such great, fantastic knowledge there of how we can actually go about taking action. So can we have the next slide, please? So in terms of how PA's transformed me as a person, I would say it's really the combination of the internship and then PA has completely altered the way that I do my food shopping, the way that I eat. I'm very much so more climate conscious now when I shop, I do think of the farmers. So for example, literally outside my front door right now there is a farmers market going on, and I'm very lucky that it's 5 seconds walk from my front door, so I have no excuse not to go. And I try and get the majority of my fruit and veg from there as much as possible. I'm also vegan. I went vegan before I started PA, but I do think I've been reading a lot more about it in terms of the climate crisis since starting PA, and educating myself a lot more about it all. And also I think the other way I've changed is I'm having conversations with my friends and my family. One of the best ways, I know we can so often feel a bit powerless, but we actually have so much power in our kind of sphere of influence of our friends and our family, and all it takes is to change one person and they'll maybe go along and spread the message, and then they'll change their food shopping habits, for example. So that's the other thing. But I would really preface that with it's about calling in, not calling out. So the goal is always to educate people in a way that you're learning from them too. It shouldn't be some I know better than you, let me preach at you kind of thing. It should be about let's call them in, let's bring them in, let's tell them the facts, and let's have a conversation, let's learn from each other, and let's try and use that in order to have the ultimate goal of shopping more locally, shopping more seasonally, and shopping more sustainably, amongst other things. So yeah, that's how PA has transformed my view of the food system. What about you, Warami?
The realization of these problems is what led me to PA as an approach towards educating on the need for justice within the food system. But as this isn't necessarily new information or a new lifestyle to me, I would say it further reinforced my drive for everyday individuals to understand the importance of their shopping and their consumption habits for the food system and the climate. As well as an aspiring farmer, I am equipped with the values that would always be with me and expressed in my growing habits. So PA made me realize my passion for this subject area and inspired the topic actually for my thesis on the tiers of sustainability of short food supply chains to consumers and producers, in order to extend literature for anyone out there who's curious. And, it has also made me understand how creative methods are widely available, and you have to speak in the different languages people understand to get your message across. It also revived my hope for a brighter future within the UK food system, and that is really important for someone as myself at the front line of the fight as a grower. It was in fact a lovely and eye-opening experience, yes. And yeah, without further ado, we're in the next slide to the Q&A session, where we're entertaining questions in the chat box that will be pointed out.
I have the question ready for you.
Fabulous.
Okay,
thank you so much, James. Thank you.
So yeah, just a really, really profound gratitude to you both. It was really, really fantastic. And I've been seeing in the chat, like I think people have found the insights equally as powerful as they have useful. I'm aware we have about 9 minutes left. I was initially planning to invite people to unmute themselves and ask questions, but what I might do is the questions that we've had in the chat so far, if people are happy for me to ask them on their behalf. And then if we have a little bit more time at the end, then we'll be able to run through that. The first one was from Becky Grove, which is, I'd love to know what you experience amongst your peers when you talk to those who don't really connect with the food system on the same level as, say, the ORFC audience. What engages them the most when you talk about your food system and climate change research and interests? So yeah, question around chatting to peers, maybe not as connected to the food system.
Okay, I could take that one. For me, I found it was a thing of action. It's really hard to be really chatty and, expressive especially when they don't share those values with you already. So I personally love to cook, and I do happen to, rate my own cooking, not to toot my own horn. So I find that when I use these things that people ordinarily, like my peers, wouldn't know how to use or what to use with it, I cook them and engage them in conversation to show them that you can actually use action. You can use your actions to kind of draw them in and include them. So it's not limited with cooking. You could find whatever way that is specific to them. I feel like when you're doing something for your peers, you have to be really intentional with what moves them. I kind of find a linkage. So if, like the way Saraya used, if someone was really into the topic of queer ecology in general, if you link that with the food system, it's really easy to connect them immediately. So just find the thing that interests them the most and the best way you can deliver it. And I found that mine was through action. So yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, I think that's such a great response there from Warami. Unfortunately, I'm not a particularly great cook, so I can't really give that as an example. But I think for me, a lot of it as well is kind of confronting them with the figures as well. A lot of people a lot of my friends are quite climate conscious, but a lot of my friends also just are not really aware of the reality. If I was to tell them how many GHG emissions a year are created by the food system, a lot of them would be really shocked. And I do think there is power in just kind of plainly sharing with people those stats and those figures as well, but then connecting it back to the fact that, because a lot of people have a very kind of defeatist approach. We saw it in one of the responses where someone said something like, oh, you know what, it's all unethical, there's nothing we can do, like the end of, I'm just going to keep shopping the way I am. It's about showing people that actually they do have power and they do have influence. For example, I'll give an example I know about, which is vegan foods. If you look at how many more vegan foods have come up on the shelves in the last few years, I mean, it's an astronomical difference. And it's by more people buying things like oat milk a bit more often, which is better for, I mean, yes, nothing's great for the planet, but it is better for the planet than dairy is, for example. So it's things like that to kind of gradually change the demand and the supply. And through conversations with our friends, I think we can encourage them. But the final thing I'd say is, it's never about saying no. It's never about saying you need to not do this, you need to stop this. It's about saying, how about once a week you could maybe try this for a change, see if you like it, see what it's like. Because when we confront people with you can't, they're gonna want to rebel and they might react with anger. So it's more again about calling people in than kind of alienating them, I'd say. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Saraya. Next question was from Sarah Allen Jones, which was, I'd be interested to know who the participants in the survey were. Was it a certain age group / demographic?
It was a real range. The oldest person that I remember was 75. The youngest person was 10. So it was a massive range, but because a lot of our focus was on the youth perspective, we did end up getting a lot of responses from the 18 to 25 age group. I think particularly between around 21 and 25, that was the most common demographic. But we did have responses from older ages as well. We didn't share this with you today because of time, but we did have a slide ready talking about the differences between older generations and younger generations in terms of their climate consciousness. But what we actually found was there actually wasn't a big difference, and that's why we decided not to share it. We didn't find any kind of astounding generational differences. We found that actually people of all ages are climate conscious. It's not necessarily that the younger generations are more so than the older generations, which I probably would have assumed, which is probably really ageist and wrong of me. But yeah, generally speaking, that was kind of what we found.
Amazing, thank you for that. There's another question here from Jane Powell. It's incredibly interesting. Would like to know how PAR works and how to create more spaces for conversations like this. Can we have intergenerational discussions too? You partially answered that question a minute ago, just with the intergenerational aspect of it. It's quite a big one. That I'm happy to speak to that if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the kind of key principles around PAR is this split between kind of a first person, second person, and third person kind of exploration, because it really, really fronts and prioritizes the kind of individual lived experience of all of us that are going through that, through a lot of reflective processes, how we understand the world as individuals, and developing that kind of self-awareness, something Warami spoke to around it doesn't come away like without changing you. And then we have this other aspect of the second person, where we were working together in this group, exploring various dialogues, creating healthy dynamics, and having kind of internal action within the groups. And then the kind of third part, which is kind of more closely related to the action phase, around kind of engaging wider society, field work, where for us that was kind of gathering data before presenting at COP26, and that was a part of the action as well. I would absolutely love to speak on that a little bit more, because there's a lot in there. There's another really interesting question, which I don't think we're going to have time to go through, from Emma, but I think, Saraya, if you're happy for our email addresses to be shared.
I've just done it.
Amazing.
I've just shared mine because I can't remember you guys' off the top of my head, but yeah.
Not a problem. Here's one I prepared earlier. It's got the 3 email addresses of us there for you. And I'm going to very quickly, Judith, grab your question as well to make sure that we've got that. And we've been invited by Anna and Amelia as well to work on Hoover to create kind of a bit of an online community around that. And yeah, we'd love to, obviously we have to jump off now, but we'd really love the opportunity to explore some of these questions further. And thank you so much to Warami and Saraya.
And thank you to James as well, and to Anna and Amelia, and thank you to everyone for coming.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you all. Thanks so much. Bye.